the very first of our CLIVAR climate risk webinars. My name is Andy Dessler, and I'm one of the organizers of a new CLIVAR working group on climate risk. It has a really long name, which I can't remember, but I just think of it as a climate risk working group. The other organizers are Adam Sobel, Amy Clement, and Alex Hall. And then we have 14 other great people on the committee. And so hopefully you'll be hearing a lot more from us over the next couple of years. One of the things we want to do is this webinar series. So hopefully this webinar will be sort of every other month. And we have three great speakers today. We have Dr. Kelly Hereid, Dr. Fran Moore, and Dr. Zong-Liang Yang. Kelly's going to go first because she has a conflict, and then Fran, and then Liang will go. So there'll be three AGU style talks, 12-ish minutes, and speakers I will tell you when you've got 2 minutes left. For the audience, there's a chat feature. I don't use WebEx a lot, but I presume it's just like Zoom. If you have questions, type them into the chat at any time. If you prefer to ask questions live, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. Everybody should be muted. At this point, people know to do that, but make sure you're muted, and we unmute yourself and ask a question, or we can do it. I don't know how this WebEx is set up exactly, since Alyssa's doing that. And then hopefully we'll have 5 or 10 minutes at the end for general Q&A. We won't go over an hour, so if we don't have time, we won't do it. But our hope is to have a couple minutes for just sort of general discussion at the end. And so with that, let's get rolling. So let me introduce the first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Kelly Hereid. She leads the catastrophe R&D team within Liberty Mutual's corporate enterprise risk group. She has a PhD in geologic sciences from University of Texas with a focus on climate science. Her expertise lies in climate change impacts, catastrophe modeling, and emerging risks. She has been recognized as a climate translator for her work making climate uncertainties more predictable for business applications. And with that introduction, let me turn it over to you, Kelly. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And I'm going to try out a new one on you guys here today. So what I'm going to be talking about today are the different components of a climate-related view of risk sitting in a business environment, where I'm going to use an example of wildfire to talk about where the physics problems lie on wildfire risk management. So what I'm going to be talking about today are the different components of what we consider a wildfire-related view, which includes climate change, of course, but also weather, ecosystems, the built environment, and public policy, and give a few examples of how you can remix different components of this system to answer interesting scientific questions as well as interesting sort of public policy questions. So for wildfire, obviously the biggest driver is temperature. So this is a map from the 5th National Climate Assessment showing 2 degrees C temperature increases in summertime. And while there obviously is a lot of spatial variability that you can see in this map, in general, the direction is very clear. It's going to get hotter. This is a relatively straightforward climate-related impact because it's coming from temperature as opposed to some of the messier of climate modeling problems. And for us, this is really helpful because it means that we can use this as a baseline to do some sensitivity testing across some of our other perils. Of course, most of this impact is coming from increase in evaporative demand, and that plays out on different ecosystems. Where things start to get a little messier from the modeling standpoint is when you start overlaying the impacts of what I'm going to describe as weather. So these are a couple of figures from a really great paper that John Botzkley wrote a couple of years ago, looking at the drivers of not just number of fires, but impact of fires. And he found that downslope wind-driven fires, even though they only constitute about 10% of the number or area of fires that burn across the Western US, they're responsible for something like 60% of structure fires, as well as over half of fatalities. So this means that by understanding this little slice, we can actually get a lot of the story of how fires are actually impacting society. That's the good news. The bad news is the map on the right, where you can see that, of course, to map downslope fires, you actually have to capture complex topography because you need a slope. So you can see where fire occurrence is happening, obviously, is in places where you're near sort of this complex topography that can drive this flavor of wind event. You'll also notice that this introduces spatially variable seasonal impacts, where, for example, most of the fire risk in California is coming in the fall, versus if you look in places like the Front Range, more of it's happening in the spring, and in the Pacific Northwest goes into the summer. So now we have seasonality, we have complex topography. This gets a little bit messier, but still is something that we can work with and is still relatively well behaved from a physics standpoint. It gets uglier from here, of course, because you have to have something to burn, and those things that burn generally start in ecosystems. So forest management practices, things like prescribed fire and mechanical thinning, can materially influence our risk. And then, of course, climate change itself is influencing ecosystems with the spread of pests and diseases outside of their normal boundaries, like the bark beetle killed forest at the picture on the top, as well as migration of entire ecosystems, for example, forests in the Sierra Nevada that are setting themselves up to move upslope. So you can see transitions in ecosystem happening spatially and across time. Of course, the other thing, and the reason why as an insurer we get interested in, wildfire in particular is because it doesn't just impact forests, although of course that's not great either. It also impacts the built environment, and how we build the built environment influences how that risk actually plays out. Where if you build structures with flammable materials, as in this test facility at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, the test building on the left is built with highly flammable materials versus the building on the right, which is exposed to exactly the same risk, a delightful ember cannon, is not burning because it's resisting that ignition from those sparks. But there's not just sort of individual buildings. Those buildings are built into communities. And so the way that those buildings get built into communities is from a public policy decision. So this is an outline of the Tubbs fire, which happened in 2017. At the time was the most destructive wildfire in California history, has since been surpassed several times. And the underlying grid is the density of the built environment, how close buildings are to each other, with a critical threshold being buildings that are within 10 feet of each other, which is where you dramatically increase the risk of building to building fire transmission, where it no longer behaves as a wildfire, but then becomes an urban conflagration, aka it's a city that's burning as opposed to a wildland fire. Of course, when we get into the densest part of this fire footprint, that's when we indeed see this urban conflagration where you have building to building burn. And this is where the most catastrophic wildfires have happened in recent years, including, of course, in LA. So the really interesting things happen when we start to take these individual components of wildfire risk and start to remix them together in interesting ways. So this is an example of a project that Manny Hernandez on my team has been working on, taking our sort of current view of our wildfire hazard maps, and these are determined using some publicly available data. It's using some of our claims data. It includes fuel layers, so that's why you see sort of like some of the detailed sort of high resolution stuff that's happening here. And then doing just a very simple exercise of doing temperature sensitivity tests, where we're just adding flat increases in temperature. Of course, this is not physically realistic. We know that there's going to be some complexity in here, but it can tell us what is the next area that we expect to see an expansion of wildfire risk, where we see in particular large expansions of risk that have sort of suitable fuel types and are near the threshold for changing temperature across a lot of, for example, Northern California, as well as places like the Front Range and the interior of the Pacific Northwest. So then when you take that climate plus weather view and you overlay it with where there are buildings, you can actually see where these concentrations of risk have accumulated. So now, where do you see expanding risk where there perhaps was lower risk in the past and that it is increasing going forward into the future? And so while spatially it overlaps with that last map that you just saw, you're also able to see where it picks out big concentrations of population. For example, as you start getting into somewhat higher elevation near population centers in the desert Southwest, as well as in expansions in places like the Front Range and the interior of the Pacific Northwest. When you aggregate these together, this can also give you information about changing risk trajectories across sort of larger geographies. So we did this analysis where we took all of these exposures and put them together at the state level. And so this is progressively zooming into sort of lower and lower levels of risk here. And of course, California is quite high on this list, and its risk continues to go up. But when you get down into sort of these middle risk states, there are some that aren't particularly sensitive to temperature changes. Maybe they're already at high enough temperatures, but they don't have fuel in places where there's a lot of exposure to be able to drive a lot of growth. But you have some states where there actually is quite a large acceleration, and they even sort of change in their order, again, depending on this intersection between exposure and increasing hazard. Lastly, you have some places where today the risk is actually relatively low, but the trajectory of change is very high. And so by doing these things at the state level, you can look for perhaps markets that might be susceptible to changes in risk in the future, and therefore susceptible to economic disruption, in addition to, of course, the change in the hazard itself. All right, so to wrap up here, I'm going to take us to my and Fran's neck of the woods, and you'll notice that if you could see underneath here, this says weather plus policy. So I'm not even including the forward-looking view of risk here. I'm taking the current view of risk. All right, so this is taking the underlying density map that I just showed you with the Tubbs fire and overlaying it on the East Bay. And this time I've outlined in red grid cells where, according to the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, there is a relatively low risk of urban conflagration, meaning buildings are spread out enough, there's low risk of fire transmitting from one building to another. As you can see, when I overlay the fire hazard maps that are produced by the state of California in yellow, there's not a lot of places that are at low enough density that you can sort of build your way out of this problem, which means that we need to be creative and bring more tools to the toolbox, knowing that climate is going to continue to exacerbate this already pre-existing policy problem of high risk of urban conflagration. And so that's where I'm going to plug a new study that my team just put out. It's a little white paper looking at how ecosystems can reduce wildfire risk. So if you can't reduce the risk in your built environment, you need to think creatively about how to use things like prescribed fire, management of invasive species, mechanical thinning, to reduce your risk in the surrounding ecosystems, to reduce your odds and better be able to do active fire management by doing this passive risk reduction in the surrounding communities. So I want to close here with, I'm going to have to thank Kevin Reed for giving me my last slide with this paper that was just published yesterday on how we can use, when we should be using sophisticated models versus when we should be using simple exercises, right? Because you could imagine that you could do a model that had very detailed, high resolution downscaling of temperature and wind. And of course, wind is really complicated to do well in something coming out of a GCM. But then you need ecosystem modeling, and ecosystems are going to shift. In some places, it's going to increase risk, and some places, it's going to decrease risk. And you have to model like population dynamics and building vulnerability and building code changes. And there's just so much on there that, is it actually still decision useful? When I would argue that because of the fact that the specific climate question, if you narrow it down to just looking at temperature, by making that a well-contained problem, holding your nastiest things stable, your ecosystems, your built environment, that means that you can answer lots of really interesting science questions by holding the mean stuff stable and doing these very simple parameter testing exercises. So again, I'm a big fan of this idealized sort of model hierarchy concept, and I think it can help us make a lot of progress in climate risk. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions because I do have to duck off before the last 5 minutes at the end.
Thanks so much, Kelly. I'm going to jump in and as the Q&A moderator now. Amy Clement, everyone, hi. Thanks for joining. Thanks for a great talk, Kelly. Open up the floor for a few minutes for discussion, questions. I see.
Fran, what do you got?
Yeah, quick question. When you did the estimates by state, so that was kind of holding population patterns constant. So there was no, like this, what you kind of pointed out in the front range is like, there's just been a lot of migration there. And, if that continues with the rising temperature, then those trends would presumably be like,
those trends would both be pointing in the same direction. And so that's where you could pick one thing and look for trajectory and then start slowly varying the other components of the system to say, which ones are the biggest drivers of the risk, right? Increases in exposure are a huge driver of climate-related risk because they're intersecting with sort of more slowly variable hazards.
Got it. Thanks.
Liang, you had a question?
Yeah, I have a question. This is a great talk. And Kelly, we Jackson School Department just fired two assistant professors in the spring. They will join us in the 2026, early 2026. One of them will do fire research in our department. So his expertise use AI. During his job interview talk, he said his fire model could predict fire like 2 weeks in advance. Do you think that kind of tool, AI tool, would help the insurance company to make useful decisions, AI modeling, prediction?
So I get a lot of wildfire AI model pitches. Depends on the AI. Many of them leave a lot to be desired. And there's a timescale question too, because like if I'm an insurance company, I write policies for a year at a time. A 2-week forecast doesn't actually help me all that much. But if I'm an emergency manager, I care a lot, right? So the end user matters a lot for the appropriate timescale. I will say that many of the companies operating in this wildfire AI space are trying to lean very heavily on data science and lack the domain relevant expertise to know their strengths and weaknesses of their underlying data sets enough to be able to interpret the wildfire AI. Obviously, a researcher who's working in that area properly is probably going to be a bit better set up. But I will say it is a very active area of interest in insurance.
Thank you.
Okay.
And yes,
have
Brian,
another.
the Eastern U.S. definitely keeps me up at night. Go read that Rolling Stone one on the Pine Barrens, or even just John McPhee talks about the Pine Barrens and how it sits on fire all the time. And that was in like the 80s. So yeah, I'm with it.
Kelly, I just sort of, in the spirit of the working group, where we're sort of the title of the working group is Accelerating the Scientific Foundations for Making these, projection of future risks, which has all these layers, which you've spelled out so nicely here. But if we just think about what other climate information, at least on the physical hazard, like what's missing? What keeps you up at night in terms of, you've handled the climate sensitivity problem by saying, okay, we'll look at 1, 2, 3 degrees of warming. We can do better than that, hopefully, in terms of spatial heterogeneity. But what would make a material difference for you all in terms of the
so to me,
thinking about future risk?
I don't think we have a good handle on is when you get the intersection between temperature and drought. We've seen some of these hot droughts behave as like flashy catastrophic events in their own right, and when they blow up as a wildfire, that to me is one of a big that combination of you have to get the hydrology and you have to get the temperature, and it's got that time varying component, and everybody argues about the right index to use for drought. That's where things can get really hairy really fast. But I also really want to emphasize that just taking where the climate science today is in really good shape and thinking creatively about how to overlap it with other areas of the built environment to look for changes in exposure is something where the climate science community, knowing what behaves well and what doesn't behave well out of the climate science, can actually be doing a lot more. I mean, we're doing just for our own portfolios, but there's an enormous amount of communication that needs to happen to say, hey, by the way, Pacific Northwest, you're one of the fastest increasing areas of wildfire risk. It may not be that, I mean, I know it's high on their list because they're trying to put out hazard maps in both Oregon and Washington right now, and it's been real sticky. Like, I think there are real policy questions at the intersection of those two that require expert interpretation of that climate science. And that's where I think the climate science community can really contribute.
Nice. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, I think we probably need to move on now. So thanks, Kelly. Our next speaker is Dr. Fran Moore. She's an environmental economist whose research focuses on the intersection of climate science and economics, including quantifying economic and social impacts of climate change, social cost of carbon, and climate adaptation strategies. She recently served as a senior economist, the White House Council of Economic Advisors. I don't know if I'm repeating myself. She's an associate professor at the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at UC Davis. So thanks a lot, Fran, for agreeing to do this, and take it away.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. The presentation I'm going to do, it is quite abstract. So I'm going to kind of really step back a little, and but I see this as quite, for me, it's been very helpful in understanding some of the challenges, fundamental challenges and dynamics going on when we think about really trying to manage the climate related risk we're seeing. So next slide. So the motivation here, I don't think you know, I work a lot with economists, so the motivation for this original work was really about insurance markets. And I don't, you know, like Kelly just spoke, like I don't think you need a ton of motivation around what you know, the challenges that U.S. insurance markets are seeing right now. But I would say this is, I think, more generally applicable to other types of climate risk management applications. So if we're thinking particularly about things like infrastructure design to like particular event standards, then a lot of like what I'll talk about here is kind of quite like transferable to that setting as well. So next slide. So I like to think about kind of climate as, you know, or like to set up this analysis. It's helpful to think of climate change as this inference problem. And what do I mean by that? Well, I really like this quote, which is, climate is what you expect and weather is what you get. And if we were going to kind of reframe that a little bit, next slide, you could say climate is a probability distribution, and then weather is a realization from that distribution. Next slide. So what are the implications of that? The implications of that climate as a probability distribution is not something that we observe, right? We cannot go out and just measure the climate. It is a probability distribution. We have to infer it in some way. So there are things that we can measure, like weather, and we make certain assumptions, and from that we kind of obtain, say, a climate distribution over different weather outcomes. So how do people go about doing this inference? And what kind of information might they use? Well, a really important like source of information for people and firms thinking about managing their exposure to climate risk is going to be local weather records. Why? Because, like, you know, we know they're highly representative and kind of unbiased like sampling of the climate distribution for that location. In addition, there's the kind of increasingly these like process-based weather, climate, or catastrophe models that are kind of also relevant to how particularly kind of more sophisticated actors like, say, insurance firms are kind of thinking about this quantification. So here, like, the question I'm asking is, how, if we think about this, the information in this historic weather record, how could simply accounting for a change in climate distribution, which I'll refer to as non-stationarity, which means that the possibility that the climate distribution is changing over time, how could that affect our assessment of current risks? And so the case study I have here is to just walk this through the intuition here is going to be about maximum daily rainfall in New York City. And so this is the kind of 30-year climatology of annual daily maximum rainfall from the Central Park rain gauge. And what we're thinking about here is an insurer's problem, where the insurer kind of has this weather record. Next slide. And what they're trying to do is kind of infer the current distribution over rainfall extremes in order to do things like, say, price premiums in insurance contracts, or to manage their exposure to kind of catastrophic risk through kind of what they choose to underwrite. But more generally, you can think of it as, how does any actor kind of look back at this kind of informational record and kind of make an inference about the current climate distribution. Next slide. To set this up, I'm going to talk a lot about the Weibull distribution, and I realize that might not be super familiar to everyone. And so just to make sure everyone's on the same page, so the Weibull is one of the family of kind of extreme value distributions. It has these kind of two parameters. Go ahead. So one is the shape parameter, which defines this kind of asymptotic behavior of the tail. I'm largely going to keep that as fixed for this analysis. So I'm going to assume that the actor kind of knows what it is and knows that it's fixed, and it is this kind of skewed distribution, but like a heavy tail with alpha set at like 2.56. What we're going to be interested in instead is the scale parameter. And what that scale parameter does, it stretches that distribution, stretches and compresses it distribution along the axis. And so we're going to think of our agents as uncertain about this parameter, and they have to learn the parameter kind of based on the information they have in the weather record. Next slide. So this is just an illustration of kind of the same Weibull distribution with the same shape parameter, just kind of stretched out based on the different values of the shape parameter. Two more slides. And so a larger value is going to kind of stretch it and put higher probability mass on these kind of more extreme rainfall values. Next slide. So I'm going to talk through two different inference processes. So one is a state where I would argue that a kind of a lot of people and firms maybe like 10 years ago, which is kind of saying, look, climate change is a thing, but everyone keeps talking about 2050. You know, if I'm thinking about my climate risk today, then I'm pretty happy assuming that the weather record I observe is kind of broadly representative of the climate distribution that I face today. And so I'll call that assumed stationarity, in the sense that the agent here is pretty happy just kind of assuming that this is all drawn from a single distribution and that there's no kind of trend in any of the parameters over time. Next slide. And so in this setting, this is going to be a Bayesian learning setting. So we have prior, so the agent is kind of entering with a prior over the theta parameter. Next slide. And then they just use the entirety of the record to update that prior into a posterior distribution over the scale parameter for 2024. Next slide. I'm now going to contrast this with a alternate kind of inference process, which is one where the agent, you know, really just says like, well, look, maybe climate change is happening in this record, right? Maybe I am no longer comfortable assuming that this scale parameter is stationary. Next slide. And so they're going to begin with exactly the same kind of prior over that initial value of the parameter. Next slide. But here they're going to kind of allow for a set of linear time trends. So it's very, I'm keeping it very simple and constrained, but like all the agent is doing is saying like, look, maybe there's a kind of time trend over this period. Next slide. And so they're going to allow for a broader set of models that says, okay, well, I have my initial value, but I also have some kind of time trend that I might be uncertain about. Next slide. And that prior that I'm putting in over that time trend is pretty uninformative, right? So, you know, we know from climate science that likely climate change is kind of increasing the kind of intensity of these extremes. But for this agent, all they're saying is like, look, it might be changing. I don't know what the direction is. I have a prior that's centered at 0. Next slide. And so what the challenge here is now the agent needs to use the same weather distribution to update their belief over not one, but 2 parameters in order to estimate the posterior distribution over the climate distribution in 2024, which is now kind of specific to 2024 because the climate distribution could be changing. And so just taking this example with those 2 learning processes, this is the kind of posterior distributions that we get over that scale parameter. And throughout this, what I'm going to show you is I'm simply going to contrast the distributions you get under these 2 learning models. So the assumed stationarity, where we're kind of like happy saying that climate change hasn't been an issue and the historic record is in green, and then the potential non-stationarity is in yellow. Go ahead. And so what you see is relative to the stationarity assumption, if these agents are allowing for these like this broader set of models, then the posterior distribution is wider, and it's also shifted to the right? And the fact that it's wider is kind of, it kind of really drops out of what's going on here, which is you have a lot of information, right? You have the same amount of data and you're now trying to infer 2 distributions instead of 1, two parameters instead of 1. So you have to be more uncertain about what that parameter looks like. It's also shifted to the right, which indicates that agents are kind of more uncertain about the kind of probability of these historically extremes. The dashed lines here are giving you the central 95% of the 2 distributions, and you really see that the action here is all in the kind of upper tail of the distributions. So if we pull out those 2 parameters and look at what that actually means for the rainfall distribution, go ahead, next slide. Then this is what those 2 distributions of daily maximum rainfall look like at the 95th percentile of the posterior distribution over the scale parameter. So you see it's not huge, right? It's not particularly dramatic. But what I'll draw your attention to is a kind of much greater probability that's going into these really extreme events. Next slide. So if we look at the probability of rainfall over 5 inches, then we see that in a day, that increases by about 50%. But the probability of rainfall over 8 inches, next slide, more than triples, right? And so even though it's still a kind of low probability, the relative increase has gone up dramatically. Next slide. I might skip this over time for time, but we can come back to this. This is just a simulation to show that this is really about the change in the inference model. It is not to do with the actual any kind of underlying trend necessarily in the data itself. Go ahead.
Yeah, about 2 minutes, Fran.
Okay, thank you. I got to keep moving. So what's going on here is the agent is very uncertain over the agent knows there's a lot of sampling variability in a 30-year record for draws from the extreme parts of the distribution. And therefore, because they lose information, they become very uncertain over what it is, over that probability. Just to make a kind of final point, and I'll push through this a little fast, but the reason we care about the extremes is not because of the physical hazard itself, but because the extremes are what drives a lot of the impacts. And so here I kind of layer on top of this distribution a impact function based on insured losses under the National Flood Insurance Program over a kind of 10-year period, over a period from 2009 to 2023. Next slide. And this is just a very kind of simple regression that shows a kind of relationship to this variable of extreme rainfall. Next slide. And so what you see is that when you layer this kind of damage function that's very steeply increasing in the level of maximum daily rainfall, what that's going to do from a loss perspective rather than just a kind of hazard perspective, is going to amplify the importance of this shift in the very extreme parts of the distribution. And so what we can do then is we can propagate these two distributions, right, of the kind of the two rainfall distributions that come from this learning model through this damage function to end up with kind of two estimates of the loss distribution under these two different inference models. And remember, all that is changing here is the agent has recognized that climate change might be present in the historic record. So there's no change in the underlying data, the factors driving the loss or the exposure. Go ahead. And so this is showing you the kind of ratio of the difference in the loss distribution between these two inference models. What you see is like the expected damages are going up by 30%. That's because there's a shift rightward in the tail. The variance in the distribution is increasing by a factor of 3. Variance is something for insurance companies that's really challenging to deal with. And you see this is really concentrated in the tails of the distribution. So I'm going to this has a lot of implications for kind of challenges in insurance markets. But this setting, like where simply the added ambiguity that comes from just the possible existence of climate change, given the limitations it then imposes on how you can interpret the historic weather record, are really quite general. And so they're also going to apply to things like trying to manage to a 1 in 100 event standard. So they're imposing costs on society. These ambiguity-related costs are like additional to any actual effects of climate change. So this is not about we're getting more flooding. This is just the cost of uncertainty. And I would say they're largely unquantified. And I think there's one more bullet. And so I think this is, this brings up the question of, well, what are there other sources of information that this working group might be interested in, like kind of climate and catastrophe models that might help limit this ambiguity? And I would say that may be the case, but they do have to be kind of well validated for the applications that they're being used for. And that validation itself raises its own challenges, given the kind of limitations of the weather record. So I apologize if I went a little long, but I will leave it there.
Hey, thanks so much, Fran. We have one question in the chat. I don't know if you can read the chat, Fran. Would this data and analysis originally be something that would have been incorporated into NOAA's modernization of probable maximum precip?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is it's a kind of Atlas 15 kind of product. Yeah, so I think my understanding is like that is like what they were trying to do. So they were kind of trying to essentially like not assume stationarity anymore and kind of have this like time varying component in the kind of information that would then go into kind of how, say, infrastructure design is kind of managing extreme precipitation. And so I think that was definitely kind of moving in this direction. The problem you still end up with this loss of information problem, because, you know, even if you're in a kind of more like structural model environment, you still have this problem of validation, and that, you know, now you're trying to validate two things. You're trying to validate just like the kind of the behavior of the model without anthropogenic climate change, and also the behavior of the model like with respect to the forced response. And so you're kind of asking more of the validation data in a way that, you know, I think it certainly like helps with this problem, and it kind of highlights why that information is so important to actors kind of seeking to kind of constrain this tail risk, but it doesn't necessarily totally solve it.
There's a second part of the question too, which is how and who is likely now to operationalize this knowledge about changing extremes?
I would say the first movers you've seen on this are the insurers and the reinsurers, because they have a lot of skin in the game, and they're also very sophisticated users of this kind of information. And so that's why you're seeing this, like, you know, early, you know, not so early now, but like these kind of signs of that instability kind of operating in these insurance markets. You know, like, I think what we would like is that other actors that have more capacity to actually not just kind of share the risk, but actually reduce the risk, would kind of also have access to this kind of information, and can kind of take action accordingly. But that is, like, you're starting to talk about kind of local governments and, you know, building engineers and things like that, where I think it's like, you know, the frictions and the cost factors are kind of pretty large.
We should probably move on.
Yep,
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Fran, for your talk. So our last speaker is Dr. Zong-Liang Yang. He is the professor in John A. and Catherine G. Jackson Chair in Earth System Sciences at the University of Texas. Dr. Liang is a professor, and he's also director of the Center for Integrated Earth System Science. He earned his PhD from Macquarie University in Australia. His research expertise includes land-atmosphere interactions, climate modeling, and hydrologic processes. And he was recently elected a fellow of the AMS. So, Liang, I'll turn it over, and I will warn you when you have about 2 minutes left.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Thank you for having me. As you can see here, the title of my talk is Translating Global Climate Models for Local Water Resilience with insights from Austin Water's Forward Plan. For those of you who are familiar with the Texas Colorado River, and this is very different from the one that flows through Grand Canyon, to Gulf California. So this is Texas Colorado River flowing from the near border with New Mexico and flowing to Gulf of Mexico. And this is the critical water resources to the people who live in Austin. This is considered surface water, and we are almost 95% dependent on this surface water supply. Can you move on to the next slide? So Austin Water has been in the past few years working on this so-called 100-year integrated water resources plan to the purpose to incorporate future climate change information in the water planning to determine whether there will be enough water given the climate change, population increase, and many other demands. So this is a very important the project. And we are in the second phase. The previous phase was done by Catherine Hereid and her team working with Austin. And 4 years ago, and Austin Water reached out to us. And as a result of agreement between the City of Austin and the UT Austin to collaborate together, addressing the water availability. Next slide. The whole work was actually motivated, inspired by a paper published by a Texas state climatologist, also a professor at Texas A&M, and his colleague, Zong-Liang Yang. He published this paper with a bunch of other co-authors, including myself. One of the recommendations from this paper is to really, to use a global climate model information for local scale, like city level water availability planning. We really need to have a by-way collaboration between the water resources managers and academics working together, knowing each other's needs and capabilities and challenges. So this is so-called co-production. And challenges for GCM side, we know, to this group, all we know, GCMs has its strengths and limitations. And, to use GCM models, we need to ask what models to use and how many models we need to include. How do we evaluate models before we have confidence in using them for applying the model for future decision making? So next slide. So speaking of a collaboration, this is a team from UT Austin. On the left, you can see I'm leading this project with professors from civil engineering, like Paula Pasalacqua and Gita Prasad, Dave Nelgi from my department, and postdoc and student. And we work with City of Austin and also the private firm, Richard Hoffpaul. He has his own consulting firm and hydrologist intimately and actively involved in the whole phase of this project. So this is a mutual production. We meet every 2 weeks at sometimes more frequent than that. We have technical board meeting from the outside experts, like from state climatologists, also from the municipal researchers and managers from other states. So they serve on the technical team to provide guidance, meet with us quarterly. But our research team meet at least every 2 weeks. I work with my students, colleagues on a weekly basis. So next slide. So everybody knows, GCM has its strengths and limitations. GCM really is powerful for large scale, like general circulation patterns, overall temperature trends, as well as the large scale features, other large scale features, but relatively poor in representing local scale hydrology, like geomorphology, hydrogeology, dealing with river network, channel flow. So therefore, to pick models for this local scale decision making, we have to do a very careful job. Move on to next slide. So as a part of this methodology for this water forward project, we first is to evaluate GCMs. Given the current CMIP 6 models available, from the 35 models we pick up, we introduce, use the established skill score by Taylor, and then evaluate all the 35 GCMs based on their historical the performance for temperature, precipitation, and the number of dry days. Definition of number of dry days is a daily rainfall less than 0.01 inches. Based on their 3 variables, their temporal, like seasonality, and the spatial patterns, we define this overall score. Because spatial patterns are better simulated than seasonal patterns, we give more weights to the spatial patterns. So as you can see, for spatial pattern temperature, spatial pattern precipitation, and spatial patterns of a number of dry days, those have higher weights. So, and seasonal patterns have lower weights. This gives us overall score. Next slide. With this, we can rank all the 35 GCMs for their performance over the Colorado River Basin in Texas. And here you see top 10 best performing models ranked from number 1 to number 10. Out of the 10 best models, we select 5 GCMs based on their performance, their relative independence, land, atmosphere, ocean models, relative independence, and also output availability. They have to have the outputs like daily minimum temperature, daily maximum temperature, and those kind of things available for in-depth analysis. Based on this, we select 5 models. Given this project is only 1 year, so therefore we it's mutual like a collaboration. So as a result of that, we pick 5 models and 3 mission scenarios, and that give us like a 15 potential cases for future climate projections. So next slide. So here you can see that with the 5 GCMs and 3 emission scenarios, you can look at the overall temperature anomalies over the Colorado River Basin relative to the long-term mean period. And this would give us some kind of assessment of uncertainty, potential uncertainty. And we have done this for temperature and for evapotranspiration and for runoff and for other variables as well. So these have been documented in the PhD dissertation. Also, is already published in the manuscript in the paper. Next slide. So given these the precipitation and temperature, the hydrologists working in this team develop a neural network model to downscale to 45 control points over this river basin. Control points means those locations we have a long-term gauge measurements for 43 standard gauges and 2 additional for the springs, because this is a hill country area. We also have springs. So given the measurements, the GCM graded data sets are downscaled and calibrated for those 45 control points. We get the stream flow for those control points using machine learning process, and the quantile mapping is applied to make sure the future projections are also consistent with historical measurements. Next slide. This is just showing the details of the quantile mapping and machine learning approach. So for the machine learning approach, 25 so-called weather features are selected. For weather features, and you can see number on the left from the top, number 1 to number 25. Number 1 is total monthly precipitation, or total monthly precipitation only for days that exceed 0.25 inches, etc. And from out of those 25 features, and the machine learning model is able to calculate the stream flow for the 45 control points. And for each of those 5 GCMs and for different emission scenarios, what you can see here, those are just an example of stream flows from historical 1980 to all 2100 stream flow for different GCMs, also for different emission scenarios. So next slide.
I have about 2 minutes left. 2 minutes left.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Here is just a highlight of some of the results. You can see the monthly stream flow measured in terms of acre feet, which is a volume unit, for different emission scenarios, also for different model periods. The early century and the middle century and later century. Overall, you can see from top left to bottom right, you can see as we move to the end of the century, the stream flows are going down. What the ocean water needs from climate scientists is this downscaled stream flow for those 45 control points, and then they will have water availability model, which has been developed by Texas A&M University over the past decades for the state of Texas. And that water availability model takes stream flow as input, and also the human demands and also other water use policy like water use and reuse, and all kinds of information. So over there, there's an additional like 666 planning scenarios are created, and the further results are shown in the bottom right, indicating potential water availability for the future. So for details, there's a paper which is published already. You can refer to that paper for the details about using climate model outputs downscaled and calibrated, and how that is used for the water use plan for Texas. So next slide. So GCMs indeed have been used here. The best performing models are selected to inform water planning and address water resilience, water availability in Texas. And this framework, working mutually between the climate scientists and the water resources managers, could serve as an example for other regions, other cities. And in the future, we also talk about use further fine resolution downscaled GCM outputs and using the runoff output directly and hydrological model directly to address stream flow. I like to mention a call to action for this CLIVAR group in terms of tools to get the fine resolution model outputs and detailed in terms including river channel network and the stream flow information for local scale water resources planning. I think lots of details to be discussed, and how this US CLIVAR could help serve as a platform to make that happen. With that, I'll stop here for questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, and I thank you for making that last point in the call to action. It's spot on again. So, are there any questions in the chat?
So the hypothesis that you employed, and it's a common one in studies like this, is that you sort of pick from the ensemble of models. First of all, thanks for the great talk. You pick from the ensembles of models those that look the best by looking at how they represent the spatial features of the historical climate, or some other things that you can verify against, like a static history, and then you pick those and you use those, say those are going to be the best at the force signal. But that's not obvious because they're two different. I mean, it's sort of a plausible hypothesis, and it's better than none. But I mean, has anybody ever tried to test it? Like, say, do it for the early part of the record and try to predict the trends in the later part of the record, or something like that?
Yeah. Yeah. First of all, we pick the 5 best model. Why only 5, not 10, not 100? So so it's based on the availability of the funding and the time, and also the the resources. We have now really done what you used to suggest to like early part of a century was the later part of century. We have not done that, but we did compare the worst performing models from our ranking against the best performing models, and the worst performing models would introduce more the variance variability, and so whether that's a good or bad, that is remain to be seen. Maybe one include more variance, but if they are not best performing, we also have low confidence in their performance. So that's a hard decision.
Okay, Christy put a paper, thanks for that, where they did this kind of testing. Sarah Vannon had a question related to atoms, I guess. Did you look at a single run of a model? You use ensembles of runs for each model to check model quality. Answers could be different for different ensemble members.
Yeah, like I said, if we include all of the 35 models, or comparing the best 5 against the worst 5, and the variance, the variability is very different. Yeah, and we are going to look at this further. We have an ongoing project funded by TWDB, Texas Water Development Board, for different river basin. So this is ongoing right now. So the questions you raise is being addressed for this new project. the project with Ocean Water already concluded, and we did not have a further funding for that. So, but fortunately, we have a new funding from TWDB. We are working with the TWDB, trying to address this. So I see a question from the chats. So somehow, if you can save the questions and email to me,
I think they're
will
mostly comments, but here's one from Alex. Paul, Alex, you want to ask it?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, just quickly, I was wondering if you had any insight into the physics behind the general streamflow decline in the river. Is it evapotranspiration declines in the basin, increases because of temperature increases, or is it a precipitation decline? Like, what are the physics behind that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this part of the work is done by the hydrologist from the private consulting firm. He developed this neural network model. Actually, when we compare the result from that neural network model with our independent approach directly using model runoff, and informing hydrology to get future stream flow, there are slightly different conclusions for the end of the century. We are trying to evaluate why there are differences, whether due to longer intensive droughts or due to the higher temperature itself, or maybe other things, changes of extremes. So, extreme rainfall in this hill country area. We know it's difficult to predict precisely from the recent tragic event. So anyway, we are investigating the physical causes. Or maybe the memory, like an atmosphere, ocean, land coupling memory. Maybe the neural network model fails to capture this long-term memory. But the GCM's modeled output may, like runoff, even though it's a coarse resolution, might capture that memory, but we don't know. We are going to investigate that. Yeah, thank you. Great question.
Okay.
Probably wrap it up.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, Andy, do you want to wrap things up?
Sure. So thank you very much to everybody who showed up, and thank you especially to the speakers. Those are really excellent talks. Yeah, our hope is to have this every other month about. And so, if you, keep your eyes out for the next one. We're still talking to CLIVAR about how to exactly figure out how to send out announcements. We may try to put together a mailing list. And if we do, certainly we'll push a lot of information to social media to sign up. So thank you. Keep your eyes out for the next one, probably in September. Thanks a lot, everybody. And we will see you in hopefully September.